Welcome back to Green Rush Live. I'm going to be your host today. I'm Josh Kincaid. I'm with the Talking Hedge podcast. With me is Christopher Smith to co-host for the next 2 hours. Christopher, how are you?
Great, Josh. Great to see you. How you doing?
Good. Happy Friday. We got a lot to talk about. We got a couple amazing guests to run down some news that just popped off last night, as a matter of fact. So running through our guests, we have Gretchen Gailey. She's a Panoptic Strategies, a DC-based cannabis law firm. She's with us. I believe she's at the airport. Really appreciate you being with us, Gretchen.
Well, I'm actually a PR firm, not law. I'm no lawyer. I just know a bunch of lawyers.
All right. Sorry about that. David O'Brien is also with us, head of the Massachusetts Cannabis Business Association. We're going to talk about the biggest deal that the host security agreement, Massachusetts now under the Cannabis Control Commission's authority. There's been some shakedowns and bribery schemes in Massachusetts. We're going to get to all of that coming up. David, thanks for being with us at Green Rush Live.
Thanks, Josh. I'm not sure you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Sweet.
Last but not least, in the backyard of where I'm at here in the Pacific Northwest, I believe, Bruce Barcott. He is a senior editor at Leafly. Bruce, thanks for being back with us at Green Rush Live.
Sure. Thanks. Good to be here.
Appreciate it. So, David, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about what happened last night and the significance of really the first news we've seen in about half a decade.
Yeah. So for the first time in 5 years, the legislature has advanced a somewhat comprehensive package on some of the reforms that we've needed sorely for the cannabis industry to flourish. You referenced the host community agreements. They also advanced social equity loan funding and social consumption, which is our last license that we're implementing here in Massachusetts. And not in this bill, but we're hoping will come is 280E reform as it relates to state tax collection. So two of those items, actually three of those items, have something to do with financing and or saving companies money. So we're pretty excited about it.
Tell us a little bit more about what are the details of it. I mean, how is that going to influence the capital coming in and or save capital that's already there?
Yeah, so your reference of calling it a shakedown, I think people call us mean when we say that against municipalities, but you're exactly right. It is a shakedown of epic proportions. Municipalities have been charging up to 3% of gross revenue, and it's appropriately called gross because they take money out of the pockets of cannabis entrepreneurs who are trying to run a business, and they don't provide receipts for it. So we've been advocating for years that not only would the legislature tighten that up and give the Cannabis Control Commission oversight, but that municipalities fess up to the fact that they've been basically pocketing money for unsubstantiated impact fees and costs that don't occur at the local level. There's a reason why the Northampton mayor back in January of 2021 said, you know what, we're not going to charge this anymore because there are no fees. The city of Amesbury with a new mayor said there are no fees, we're not going to charge for it. There's a reason why there's two lawsuits, one in Haverhill, one in Gloucester, saying, you know what, we're not standing for this anymore. So municipalities are starting to get the message, but it's probably going to take one of those lawsuits to be victorious to send a shockwave through the industry. On the social equity loan funding, we're a little late to that argument for the industry. I know New York is attempting to do a $200 million loan fund just for retail for social equity. The first batch of funding, based on it being a percentage of excise tax collected, will be about $18 million in Massachusetts. It'll be for all license types, not just retail, so that's exciting. 280 is not in this bill, as I said, but that's a big savings to the industry, even if we can just decouple it for state tax collection.
Mm-hmm. Gretchen, last week we heard a lot from DC with regards to the MORE Act. What are they saying right now with regards to what we're seeing in Massachusetts?
Well, I have not heard much coming up about, Massachusetts down here in DC. For us, it's the end of the week and everyone's just happy taking their victory lap on the MORE Act. So things come to Washington a bit slower than they get done in the States. We shall see.
Mm-hmm. How is the MORE Act going to impact a state like Massachusetts? What's the excitement and buzz going around in DC?
Well, there's a lot of excitement and buzz from advocates that this has passed. I wouldn't say there's a lot of excitement, though, that it's going to go much further. We don't expect to see much support on the Senate floor, and with the CAOA still expected from Senator Schumer, Wyden, Booker coming up, they keep telling us the end of April. We shall see if that's true. But with that looming ahead, I don't see any other piece of cannabis legislation hitting the Senate floor anytime soon before that does. So a lot really hinges on that. But people have compared the MORE Act and the CAOA, saying that they're fairly similar. And since the MORE Act didn't garner much bipartisan support, it only had 3 Republican votes on the House floor, I wouldn't expect you to see much Republican support for either piece of legislation in the Senate.
Interesting. There's going to be a few bills coming up. I think Christopher's got a whole list of that we're going to be talking to in the next segment. But Bruce, with Massachusetts having the first news in 5 years, is there any significance that you've seen or read about, or that you will be writing about in Leaf Leaf with what's happening on the East Coast?
Yeah, actually, it's quite significant because this is one of the, I think, the few states that has come back to take another bite at the apple. Too many states are like my home state of Washington, well, our home state here of Washington, where once legalization is passed, the legislature has been pretty slow to pick up any sort of smaller reforms that are wanted or needed. Here in Washington state, we passed legalization without allowing home grow of any kind. I mean, I guess medical patients can grow, but others can't. And we've been trying to get that passed through the legislature every year since, to no avail. There's just little interest on the part of legislators, and they're like, well, didn't we deal with that already? We have other things to do. But also, I think I think from a national perspective, or at least for those of us on the East Coast, we're pretty impressed that Massachusetts is taking up and dealing with these host community agreements. You know, they were an interesting pilot project when y'all passed legalization, but I mean, some of the things that have come out since, especially with the Haverhill details. We ran a story last year, and this came out. I think the details came out thanks to Shalene Title, the former commissioner there, and Haverhill was charging, when they charged the 3 cannabis businesses in town $1.3 million and claimed impact fees, and included training for officers to recognize marijuana impairment, a one-time $17,000 cost for uniforms, weapons, holsters, and other personal gear for their officers, and 6 additional officers during the day and night shifts to cover cannabis shops. And like, there are 3 cannabis shops. They're just stores. They don't require extra policing. I mean, it was sort of ridiculous on its face. And I think, I mean, that was a real shock to the rest of us around the country. But the fact that the legislature in Massachusetts is addressing it, good on you. I'm really impressed.
It is pretty significant to have somebody go after something 5 years. Bruce, you're probably more than aware of the Class C felony on maintaining and operating a marijuana lounge that's been around for 5 or 6 years. And naively, I thought that would come and go in Washington state, and it's been around, and they haven't even addressed it. And yet just recently they made a move to remove the word marijuana. So they're taking time for the industry, but it's just kind of at their own pace. Christopher, do you have any opinions about why they would do this now? Why they would wait, 5 years and then just kind of decide on the timing of it all?
It's very tough to say. I think that Gretchen and I will discuss many times. There goes my camera going sideways. Sorry. About but the priority of cannabis versus the priorities of all the other sort of world concerning events, and whether or not cannabis is as a high priority for others, and including legislators, as it is for us. So it may be a factor of that they just sort of got around to it 5 years later, because they actually didn't really put it on a priority in any particular year. It seems to me that that happens quite a bit. It certainly happens at the very top levels. We talk about Joe Biden all the time. He doesn't care enough. But then he will always say, well, I've got COVID, I've got Ukraine, I've got inflation, I've got these other major issues. Cannabis settle down. So I think it may be a little bit of the relative value of where we fit in the universe of things.
Mm-hmm. David, what are the downstream effects to this? I'm thinking of capital and what just happened in New York, the $250 million with Scott's coming in. Is this going to put more of a spotlight on Massachusetts now that it's seeing more attention to the industry, or is this just going to hit the newswire and go away?
Yeah, I think on the social equity loan fund, I think that's exciting. I had a legislator ask me 2 months ago, is it too late for this? I said, well, we've got at that time 200 open retail dispensaries. You tell me. I mean, are we going to do the next 50 and make them all social equity? Probably not. I think access to capital has been a barrier to entry for everybody in the space, particularly social equity and economic empowerment applicant pools, which we call them in Massachusetts. Too often Black and brown communities that were harmed by the war on drugs. So we welcome the fund. We've been advocating with the Cannabis Control Commission for as long as we've been in existence, which is December of 2017, that we need this kind of funding. It's taken this long, in part, I think, because to Christopher's point, there's not, I mean, we've been beating the drum, but there's not a big burning urge in legislative circles to vote on cannabis more than once every 5 years in Massachusetts as it occurs. So we're excited about the funding. We're excited about the relief that may be coming to the industry on the two pieces of legislation. So we continue to push forward. The frustrating part about the municipalities, if to the point of sort of reading what the Haverhill lawsuit has had, it's just been a lack of transparency and blatant overreach by municipalities. And, they've been getting away with it. And we can change this law. That's not going to fix it. It's going to take a win in court to get operators to sort of feel their oats about this and save the money that they've been paying. It's been a blank check. It's just frustrating.
Well, yeah, efficiencies are one thing, but trying to get officials to do the right thing is another. Bruce, have you written about any of the issues and schemes in Massachusetts? The former Fall River mayor was in jail for accepting payments, for example.
As a lifelong journalist, a juicy story like that, it pained me not to be able to cover that pretty extensively. But no, I didn't cover the Fall River case much. We did keep an eye on it here. But to one of David's points earlier was that question of is it too little too late? And I think I'm looking at Massachusetts as a state of 7 million people, 200 stores, and I'm living in a state of roughly 7 million people with 600 stores. So I'm looking at it from the perspective of, boy, you got a lot of stores that there's still a lot of room to open. There are a lot of market to grow. So it's interesting to see different states at different spots on the spectrum in terms of maturing markets and everything. So 200 stores is plenty of room for more entrepreneurs in there.
Mm-hmm. Gretchen, is it too little too late? We always hear about promises made by politicians, and then we seem to wait for things to happen, especially in the cannabis industry. Is it too little too late for some of the bills that have recently passed the House or might pass either the Senate or the House?
I'd say absolutely not. I think, cannabis is coming into its prime in the federal legislature. I mean, if you look at it in the past, they weren't even considering cannabis bills in recent years. So it's not as if, we missed the boat. They weren't even getting on the boat before. So finally, they're actually addressing some of these concerns and looking at them. I think another thing, to the point of too little too late, I don't think there's too little too late at all when it comes to the Northeast. These are new markets that are just coming online. Cannabis has not been ingrained in the hearts and souls of, the Northeast like it is in California and out West, when you guys have had it for years, since the 90s, really. I mean, of course, we've had it, but not to the extent that it's a part of the culture, like I would say that is in California. So for new markets like New Jersey, Massachusetts, which has been up and running a good bit better than others, New York coming online. Hopefully Pennsylvania will someday figure out their legislature and get their asses moving, but that's neither here nor there. But it's a major population base in the Northeast. And so I think that's what's really starting to help the folks in Washington bring cannabis more into their focus, is now it's hitting home more. Now they're seeing it with a lot more of their constituents, and they see this a lot more on the East Coast. I think it just rings true to them a bit more than, how the far and away California. It's, everyone looks at La La Land, especially from Washington, and it's like, oh, those people out in California, they're all nuts. But when you see, no offense, but when you
flakes
see
and
it
nuts.
in our backyard,
Thank you very
all of a
much.
sudden,
Flakes and nuts. Thank you very much.
flakes and nuts who eat avocados.
That's-
I mean, the
that's
closest we
right.
get to avocado is guacamole for the Super Bowl. That's about it.
Avocado toast. Thank you very much.
So I think it's finally starting to hit home a lot more on the East Coast, and that's why you're going to start seeing some more traction. Do I think much is going to happen this year? No. I think maybe you'll see safe banking. Maybe the HOPE Act coupled with safe banking can get through. I think that's all you're going to see on the federal side. But the conversation has started, and I think it's going to keep coming in the coming years.
If I might add something, Josh, I agree with Gretchen almost on most things, even though you might not think so, Gretchen, but I really do actually. But one of the things I think that's helping us push this conversation, and it's sort of the business that all of us are in really, which is bringing the stories of cannabis out of the context of the stoner culture of California and the Pineapple Express and the Cheech and Chong and all that, pulling it away from that and making sure that it's centered on normal people's actual experience, whether it's medicinal or whether it's use for a mental health condition or a chronic pain where 30% of Americans suffer from it. Like putting it in the mainstream and really making it much more normalized is really helping the cause. And as much as we can do that, I think that it helps hopefully push the ball down the field in Washington and the state legislatures as well.
Yeah, picking up on that, I think that the coming of retail stores in New Jersey and then New York is really going to help. But also it's going to be fascinating to see what happens when Virginia opens like that. And I mean, that is not just DC's backyard, that's DC, right?
Sure.
So it'll be really interesting to see what effect those eastern states, I mean, Massachusetts already made great inroads there, but then coming in with New Jersey, New York, and then, Virginia right there in DC will be interesting to watch and to see how many votes eventually turn when those states, open their stores.
Well, and to Bruce's point, Virginia is a very conservative state. I mean, other than the suburbs of Washington, D.C., it's a highly conservative state. So to see how they embrace cannabis is definitely going to be interesting. And some of the early dispensaries we've seen open have been down around the Virginia Beach area, around Norfolk, where all the military is based. Mm-hmm. And truly for veterans and for our war fighters who are looking for relief, cannabis has really been making a strong argument. And a lot of, especially on the right side of the aisle, that's where they're getting on board with this argument. So it should be interesting to see how they take it up, because Virginia is definitely going to take a much more conservative approach to it, but they're ready to get into this.
Great point.
What do the people of Massachusetts have to look forward to when the Massachusetts adult use market reaches its maturity? What's that going to look like? Is it fairly conservative right now, like Arizona, that likes vape pens but not pre-rolls? We're seeing California 40% flower. What is the market share? What do people enjoy in the Massachusetts market? I'm wondering, both from a consumer standpoint as well as businesses and investors that are looking to come into the market, and where they might settle out.
That to me.
Sure, David, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, flower rules still. Edibles and vapes not far behind. I think as the market matures, we're starting to see prices start to come down a little bit for the consumer. So now you're starting to see some operators say, "Uh-oh, I was thinking these high prices would last forever, and my price per pound is at a certain point, and I didn't plan for this." So that offering, we're a pretty wide offering of all types of products. I think there isn't, I don't think there's much that we're not offering here. So that is exciting for the consumer. It's exciting for the operator to be able to offer that. But we're starting to see some price drops now with more and more cultivation and manufacturing hitting the market to provide to those 207 stores open. But there's right behind that, there's another, I think, almost 200, 180 stores that are in the queue to open. And then there's another, I think, twice as much cultivation in the pipeline that could open. So when all that hits the market, prices are going to drop.
Mhm.
And Massachusetts also enjoys being in the close proximity to New York, which is yet to put one reg together. We've seen from when legislation generally passes, it takes about 2 years for a market to get up and running. So Massachusetts is still going to be able to play off of New York still trying to get their act together. This past summer, I went up to the Berkshires to check it out. And, my friend was telling me so much about the Berkshire cannabis scene. I'm like, okay. And so I went up there to see it. And she said they're trying to become the Humboldt of the East Coast. I'm like, all right, well, I think you guys got a little ways to go. But speaking to a dispensary owner there, he's in a town, I think it was Lenox, Massachusetts. He said population 6,000. He's like, average on week, I see about 7,000 customers coming through the doors during tourism season. Just people are piling through there left and right. So I think they're going to do just fine.
New York and Connecticut are frequent customers to Western Mass and the Berkshires for sure.
One of the things that we find, when we do our annual jobs report at Leafly, we look at sales in every state and we look at how that's broken down into different product categories. And I remember 6 years ago when there was a lot of assumption about, with the maturing of markets, that you would see sales of flower drop pretty precipitously as edibles and other form factors like vape pens and things like that came into the market. And I've been personally like really surprised at how at the staying power of flower pre-rolls, but it is still just consistently 50% of sales just about every state. I mean, even Colorado, it's the pure form of cannabis still kind of rules. It's been amazing how it's stayed in there, even as these more interesting form factors come in. And I think we've seen, you see a more acceptance of things like edibles among non-regular cannabis consumers, but among regular cannabis consumers, they love their flower.
I think you're seeing those trends, Bruce, because typically, if somebody enjoys, a couple of beers on their Saturday night to relax, they're not all of a sudden switching over to cannabis because, yay, cannabis is legal. Yeah. I think you're seeing the purists and the folks who've always consumed now turning to the legal market and seeing what they can adopt. The folks who are trying the newer things like edibles and vapes and tinctures, those are the younger folks who are a little more adventurous. But I think really what we're seeing is not an influx of, new consumers. It's an influx of consumers just coming into the legal market. And those are the folks who are used to flower and love it dearly.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, Gretchen. It's always occurred to me that the people have been using it all along. Now they're just sort of coming out into the light. And so when we even talk about statistical analysis or surveys about how many people used cannabis back in, such and such a day versus today, and there's increase in users, I've always thought it's really only an increase in people admitting that they use, but they've been using it all along. It's probably, I'll bet you in reality, it's a very steady number.
I remember talking to a few alcohol lobbyists a couple of years ago. Some report came out, some data that said that, alcohol sales had seen a 15% drop because of cannabis. And these people are losing their minds and they're calling their lobbyists trying to figure out what's going on. And basically we said back to them, well, did you see a 15% drop? And they're like, well, no. And we're like, then shut up. I'm like, there's bad studies out there all the time. Just because the study said it didn't make it true. Yes, we've seen some impact, but not nearly the impact that people think is going to happen.
Right. Gretchen says, then shut up.
What about some advice for the Massachusetts market? Christopher, you're in California. They had medical marijuana in the mid-90s, and yet we're still seeing chaos. So for anybody who thinks that, once it goes adult use, then everything's over and that's the end of it. You can look at California and see the current chaos and understand that that's not really the case. So what advice do you have, having lived through that and seen it? It doesn't have to be good advice, by the way, but what advice do you have for the Massachusetts market and what they're going through right now?
A couple of things. Massachusetts market has always seemed to me, Massachusetts generally, has always seemed to me to be centered around its educational base. I mean, the Boston hub of Harvard, MIT, BU, BC, et cetera, all the way, across the state, all the way to Williams and Berkshires, and et cetera. So the educational quality and the educational value is so high. So whenever I see a conversation about medicinal marijuana, I always want to know, when is Harvard University going to demand cannabis be legalized, or at least access to medicinal cannabis, so that they can test it and find out what's inside and find out what's good for people. I'm just amazed that the medical community is not more active about this. They've been sort of sidelined. And if you look at Israel, if you look at other countries around the world that are now just eating our lunch in this way, I can't imagine that there's not more demand from the intellectual community to try to get a hold of cannabis and really understand it, number one. Number two, we have a huge problem in California right now, which has to do with licensing. We have an enormous amount of production. We have enormous amount of growing capacity, and we have a very tiny amount of retail capacity. So we have this giant amount of product trying to fit into a very tiny pipeline. The reason it happened is because in California, the League of Cities came out strong and said, we're not going to take the sort of dictates from Sacramento on our city. We want our local control to rule, right? So something like 70% of the municipalities in California opted out of cannabis. And so we have all this production, and 70% of the cities and towns around California opted out, and so don't allow any retail. So we have a huge problem, right? We can't sell all that we create. Small farmers are getting crushed. Prices are going down. Tax revenues are going down. Everybody's in turmoil. So I think that the opt-out issue, I think, is really overblown by the local communities. I believe that what they don't understand is that if you have legal cannabis retail in your city, it is more likely that crime is going to go down, that teen use is going to go down. The argument is always about save the children, protect the children, and we don't want children to get at it. Well, if you don't want children to get at it, put a dispensary in the town, because that person who owns the dispensary probably put $1 million into the dispensary in terms of security and resources and staff and supplies, etc. There's probably $1 million in there. So they're not going to sell to underage people. They're not going to. The person that's going to sell to underage people and who's going to keep the kids at risk is the drug dealer, right? So if you don't have a dispensary in town, the drug dealer thrives. He gets to do whatever he wants. That's how your kids get a hold of it. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and this sort of legacy misunderstanding about the dangers of cannabis and how it's going to attack our communities and get into the children, all of that. And I think that our storytelling ability has to really meet the challenge and make sure that people understand that it's really the opposite. And I think that Massachusetts people are smart enough to understand that. And I hope they get it, and I hope they do it differently.
Yeah, we're watching that happen, Christopher. I mean, Massachusetts was by ballot, so 91 of our 351 cities and towns opted out. Not all of them took the vote at the local level in their legislative body to say, we really meant it, we don't want to be in. And there were many of those were smaller communities, like really tiny towns out in Western and Central Mass.
Sure.
What we're observing to our neighbor to the west, in New York, a lot of those communities opted out for a reason that was out of fear, and because they said, we don't know what we don't know, and we can opt back in pretty quickly and easily. So I think nearly half or even greater numbers opted out for social consumption and for retail, the only two that they could opt out. I think out of fear, because it was fear of the unknown, because they didn't know what the rules were going to be. I think you'll see a lot of those come back in. And it wasn't big cities, it wasn't even medium-sized cities, and it was a lot of towns and villages. So I think you'll see a bit of a scramble to come back in that case. I've not followed the other neighboring states as closely, but I've watched New York, because a bunch of our operators are planning to do some stuff in New York.
Yeah, and New Jersey's had the problem. I know Connecticut. I mean, it's a story. It's a theme that is happening.
Right. We're watching that, and so we're so convinced. I mean, at Leafly and our editors are so convinced that it is a question of access, consumer access. That means licensing and opening retail stores where consumers can purchase. Consumers are not going to drive 45 minutes to an hour each way to find a legal store when the local market will supply them. And what we're talking about right now is reframing this issue from the idea of opt out to asking the question, why are you opting in to supporting your local illicit street market? Why are you supporting the local illegal market instead of local entrepreneurs, instead of people who card at the door every single time? I mean, I've been to a number of local town council meetings where concerned parents stand up, the concerned doctor will stand up, and they will put it to politicians. Why are you voting for marijuana? Why are you putting our community at risk? And there are too few people who are frankly, bold enough to stand up and say, why are you supporting the street market? Why are you supporting illegal drug selling in our town when we could have a very highly regulated and safe environment instead? And so we're working on that framing. I think the opt-out framing is too easy for politicians to just say, oh, well, I'm in favor of safe communities, so I'm not going to allow this in our town.
Gretchen, anything that you've seen from Panoptic strategies and have some advice for the Massachusetts market?
No. I think Massachusetts will figure out in time what they need to do. I mean, honestly, when they first legalized years ago, Massachusetts looked to me to be, one of the leaders in the market because they were considering social equity and trying to put things first when other states didn't even consider it. I think Massachusetts is doing fine. I think they're on par for, typical market development. I think they'll pull it together. I have no concerns about Massachusetts. There's plenty of other bad markets in this country, much worse than Massachusetts.
Yeah. Well, the Washington market is a perfect rollout. There's nothing to learn from the Washington state market at all. Perfect rollout, perfect model, and nothing from this petri dish experiment.
I will shout out to Massachusetts and the data your state puts online every single week, every month. We love it. They are truly the far and away the leader in data transparency. And as reporters and editors, we love it.
Yeah, they built that in from the very beginning, and they do deserve a ton of credit for that. Sean Collins and his team over at the Cannabis Control Commission. And again, I mean, part of this is to be able to tell that story again to our friends in New York. We've been hosting delegations coming here who are like, show me what this looks like. Like, so how far into this industry are you? And, the last months ago, we hit the 2.5, 2.6, $2.7 billion in sales mark from the first two stores opening from November of 2018 to present day. It's not a theory anymore. It's not an experiment. Is it, oh, will it work? Did the sky fall? Last time I checked, the sun came out today. Right. This is not plutonium. You just need to tell people that, and framing it as an interesting sort of, you're going to support the illicit market or the legal market, and the legal market, and here's all the benefits of the legal market. We have a vested interest in selling that. But to say you're then, by not supporting the legal market, you are therefore supporting the illicit market. And that's not a good thing.
Sure. I maintain that actually anyone in America, and this may be a little bit hyperbole, but I think that anyone in America is, if they want to get some cannabis, they're 2 phone calls away. Even my 85-year-old mother, if she wanted to get cannabis, she's in Connecticut, if she wanted to get some, either she knows a person who has it, or she knows the person who has their own dealer, let's say, or their own store or their own whatever, but 2 phone calls anywhere in America. So if that's what people want to keep supporting, they should, hate on legal cannabis because they're scared of it. But otherwise, 2 phone calls and anyone can have cannabis anytime.
David, we're late for a union mandated 420 break, but before we do that, is there anything that you want to talk about before we go to break?
No, we're excited about the future. We've got some growing pains we've gone through. The bill that got reported out didn't go far enough on HCA reform, and we're going to continue to be loud and proud about beating the drum on the fact that it needs further repair.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to go over some 4 bills. Gretchen mentioned a couple of those. You don't want to miss that. Christopher is going to help us out as well. So don't go anywhere. Green Rush Live is going to be right back after this commercial break.
Pro Cannabis Media programming is available live and on demand on our Facebook page at Pro Canna Media, on Instagram at Pro Cannabis Media, on LinkedIn also at Pro Cannabis Media, on YouTube and YouTube Live on Pro Cannabis Media, Twitter at Pro Canna Media, and on twitch.tv/Pro Cannabis Media. So like, share, and subscribe to all of our content, newsletters, and shows live or on demand.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.